Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Gessel, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. MoAD is a contemporary art museum, and our exhibitions and programming inspire learning through the global lens of the African diaspora. I want to acknowledge the challenging circumstances that still remain for many of us, and I especially want to acknowledge, and my heart goes out to everyone in Haiti who is suffering from the recent earthquake that just happened there. MoAD stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter in recognizing and condemning white supremacy and the ongoing systemic violence against Black people. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Andre Hill, Dante Wright, and Ma'Khia Bryant. We grieve for so many others who have lost their lives at the hands of state-sanctioned violence, including those whose names we do not know. We want to acknowledge that MoAD's commitment to racial justice is ongoing, and as such, we will continue to say their names and hold space and honor these victims. As many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose land we are located. With deep respect, MoAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, we reside on unceded native lands and thank the Ramaytush and Chochenyo Ohlone peoples of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. This evening, I welcome you to the program series African Diaspora Film Club, occurring monthly with Cornelius Moore, who is the co-director of California Newsreel, the 53-year-old social issue nonprofit film distribution and production company. He is also an independent film curator specializing in works from and about the Black world. Modeled after a book club, we expect that you will have already viewed the film when you join us for this discussion. And if you haven't seen the film, please stick around. You can still view it on pbs.org. And I want to thank Black Public Media for co-sponsoring the series and to POV for collaborating on this program with us. Today, we will discuss the documentary Stateless and are thrilled to have joining us for the discussion the director and writer, Michèle Stephenson. Canadian and filmmaker and artist, Michèle Stephenson pulls from her Panamanian and Haitian roots to think radically about storytelling and disrupt the imaginary in nonfiction spaces. She tells compelling, deeply personal stories that are created by, for, and about communities of color that reimagine and provoke. Her feature documentary, American Promise, was nominated for 3 Emmys and won the Jury Prize at Sundance. She is a Guggenheim Fellow and a creative capital artist. And we're very happy to have her with us today. We will start the discussion with Cornelius and Michèle, and we encourage everyone to participate by making comments and sharing reactions in the chat and submitting questions. And finally, please take a moment to type where you're joining us from in the chat. We love finding the diaspora in our audience. So thank you, Cornelius and Michèle, and please start your conversation now.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome, Michèle. Thank you for being with us and for making your very powerful film. And as we know, your film is set in Dominican Republic. However, it's also very timely with the earthquake in Haiti and the threatening of a tropical storm hitting the nation too. So can you let's talk about that and what you know about what's going on and etc.
Well, what I know is pretty much what's in the news. I mean, I have spoken with my cousins who are all based in the Port-au-Prince area. And so my understanding is in the Southwest right now, the death toll has gone up to, I think, close to 800. I'm sure there's going to be more. I can't imagine because I'm thinking back to 2010. It's interesting because for me, there is sort of a connection and sort of a triggering back. There's a bit of, I would think for everyone a sense of PTSD also with the 2010 earthquake. I actually went down there with some support from Black public media 4 weeks after the earthquake of 2010 and did a series of short pieces really focusing on the mutual aid that was happening among Haitians, sort of taking the lens away from international and foreign aid, which is what is happening right now as well. It's Haitians coming to the support of other Haitians. And it's interesting in terms of full circle for me, I actually strengthened connections with Dominicans who also were one of the first ones to come over to assist. And there was a young Dominican contingent working with young Haitians to sort of collaborate, break down stereotypes, but really also provide assistance. And I frequented and made friends with some of those people who eventually sort of opened their doors and their network to me after the 2013 sentence that took place with the Dominican Supreme Court that denationalized Dominicans of Haitian descent. So it's sort of through this network of disasters and documenting those disasters that I was actually able to even, looking at the steps, meet Rosa Iris and her work defending the rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent. But I think, one of the things I try to focus on in this sense is, the community is resilient, and that, I stand in solidarity with the work that's happening down there to help each other.
Well, thank you. It's encouraging to know that there are Dominicans who are acting in solidarity with what's going on in the nation of Haiti. And also, I'm glad you lifted up the on the ground work being done by people in Haiti, because as you point out, nothing against some of the relief agencies, but I've gotten already emails from partners in health, and I like them. But also I know that locally there's a group called the Haiti Emergency Relief Fund, which is also really of people based Haitian Americans, but also with ties to people based on the ground. So people can look for that as a way to support people. Well, I wanted to begin asking you how you got involved with making this project about the effort to strip people of Haitian descent of their citizenship in the Dominican Republic. Maybe begin by also reviewing what that Supreme Court decision was in 2013.
Sure, I can start with the Constitutional Court's decision, which really is basically making sort of legal by ruling what was sort of already happening in practice, and that there were a lot of Dominicans of Haitian descent that were constantly having a lot of difficulty just getting the proper papers that they had a right to at that time. But with the Supreme Court decision that happened on September 23rd of 2013, the court ruled that people who were born in the Dominican Republic of Haitian ancestry, their birth certificates were no longer valid. So from one day to the next, you have about 200,000 people who had legitimate birth certificates, who from one day to the next are no longer recognized. And the reason why we know that it is specifically targeting Haitians and it's sort of an anti-Black legislation is they made it retroactive to 1929. And the reason, on paper, it said the children of transient people, but they made it specifically retroactive to 1929 when the border between Haiti and the DR was made official. Like there was that delineation for those who don't know, under the US occupation, which the US occupation also fostered and supported the rise of the dictator Trujillo, who was basically a white supremacist president who enacted many violent violently sanctioned things against Haitians and against darker skinned Dominicans. And so fast forward to 2013, this particular decision was clearly targeting Dominicans of Haitian descent. So people found themselves stateless from one day to the next.
Mm-hmm.
So I heard about the sentencia, they call it, in the news, but also through networks of friends that I was mentioning, earlier, that I had actually had a network of people that I frequented, that I became friends with through the earthquake in 2010, and Dominicans who were working on to defend the rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent, as well as collaborating with Haitians across the border. And so, we were just coming out. My partner and I were just coming out of a very intense community engagement campaign with American Promise, and thinking about what other projects we could do. And, it's always the personal that sort of comes to the front for us. And it just felt like the right moment for me to, revisit the ancestral island where my family is from, not necessarily from the DR, but I have family connections through the DR. I have family members that have married Dominicans, family that has lived in the DR. And so 6 months later, I was on a plane with two other colleagues starting the research to see what kind of stories we could tell from this, of course, diasporic lens that I, inhabit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you in the beginning of the film, you give us a historical background about Trujillo and the massacre, the Parsley massacre, and I looked at what that meant. Well, I was the Parsley, but you would know what that was about. Perejil, right? Perejil is in Spanish for parsley.
Yes.
And
yes. Yeah.
Did
you want me to?
Yeah. Say more about that, please.
Yeah. So 1937, and I feel like it's interesting also to look at these phenomena of anti-Black violence from a hemispheric lens, and looking at the period of time and what was, happening from, the lynchings and destructions of towns in the United States, the whitening, in Brazil, the whole policy of racial democracy, which was more about whitening the population, and the rise of Trujillo, whose grandmother is Haitian, by the way. But it's a reflection of how much, white supremacy is internalized in each one of us. And so 1937 was the Trujillo basically ordered his military to go to the towns near the border, from as close to Santiago, which is north, about, it's about an hour from the border, all the way to the border to exterminate what they saw, Haitian migrants, some who had lived there for many, many years, and their descendants. And in that fury, darker skinned Dominicans were also murdered. So in some cases, what they would do, the Parsley comes in, they would knock on people's doors, and they would ask the person to pronounce the word perejil in Spanish. And the thing is that if your mother tongue is Creole, you'll have a hard time rolling your R's in Spanish. So it was a language test. I mean, it was a deeply sort of fascist, Nazi, practice to distinguish between, because you can't necessarily distinguish by skin color, because, the Dominican Republic is a very African and dark-skinned country. And so they used that test to separate and then to murder. And people were specifically ordered to not use guns, right? To use their machetes and to use their knives in order to keep the incidents quiet, and to do it in a way. And so this lasted for a few days, the massacre, and it's one of the acts of genocidal extermination of our hemisphere that is still not really accounted for or commemorated. And they say anywhere between, we're not sure of the numbers because they're unmarked graves along the border, anywhere between 8,000 to 20,000, we don't know. And I actually interviewed when I was doing the research, that 6 months later, I had always envisioned connecting this massacre, this violent act with what's going on today, which is more of a bureaucratic violence, right? A social death that's being practiced. That you don't need to be violent, to be physically violent in order to enact violence and to make people, to disappear people. And so just to make it a little bit more complex in that, there were Dominicans who were forced to dig the larger graves. I interviewed some of them who were in their 90s at the time. And there were others who hid people, who hid Haitians and their families, who were either their employees, and hid them in their homes. And the story of Moraime in the film is really, she's fictionalized. She's based on this book that was written by a Dominican novelist, and who wrote a number of chapters of different moments during that period. It's called El Masacre se pasa a pie. The massacre is crossed by foot, because it's also the river that separates Haiti from the DR is called the Massacre River. And it's interesting, not because of this massacre, but it's more under colonial times when, pirates were killed and there was a lot of violence during that time. But sorry, I'm sort of digressing.
No.
But so I spoke with people who had hidden Haitians, and then I also spoke to people who were very young, who had fled and crossed the border, who lived in Wanament on the other side of the border, and who still suffer to this day in their late 80s, early 90s at the time from PTSD, and refused to step back, to ever step foot in the DR. So there's a lot of we have it's a moment in history that needs to be commemorated and recognized in the pantheon of acknowledging these acts of genocide and specifically anti-Black act of violence.
I did not realize that the method of killing the way you described it, and I'm horrified. I mean, even more. And I think your use of Moraime, is that how you say her name?
Moraime.
Moraime, their narrative and story is very inspired to use that in the film, and thank you for that. How did you decide on the characters? Well, did the film always was about following particular characters, or is that something you came to while you're making the film? And that's one part, and the other part is, how did you find Giandomi? Is how you say her name?
Rosa Iris, Giandomi, Rosa Iris.
Rosa Iris.
Yeah.
And Gladys. How did you find them?
Okay, so from a creative standpoint, I had always wanted to do somewhat of a hybrid sort of approach. I always wanted to anchor the piece in character-driven stories. And I'd come from 13 years of working on one project that was heavily observational driven. So I wanted to still continue that, which is sort of the more contemporary work. But I did want to juxtapose it with history, with playing a little bit with some fictionalized, elements, stylized elements from which the story of Moraime came out, of this legend that was sort of informing also the present day. But with that in mind, with the observational work, the initial research was really trying to find people who were directly affected from statelessness, and people who were working in the field to help sort of clarify and help us understand the legalities and what was going on the ground. And the first place I hit was this organization through this network that I know called Reconocido. And Rosa Iris works for that organization. It's a grassroots organization run by and for Dominicans of Haitian descent to defend their rights on multiple levels, including the specific one of getting, their papers, their documents legitimately back. And so the head of that organization introduced me actually to two individuals, Elena Lorac, who was at the time actually stateless herself, and Rosa Iris, who has stateless people in her family, grew up in a sugarcane community, but herself, because her mother is Dominican, was not threatened by the decision. She had her legitimate papers and they weren't taken away. And so I followed a number of people, including Elena, who didn't end up being in the full film, but I ended up making a short film of her story, which actually was recently at Black Star Film Festival. And then Rosa Iris, for me, I couldn't ask as a storyteller for a better collaborator, a better participant. She opened herself up completely in terms of us being able to hang out with her and stay with her. She provided direction also in terms of really envisioning who were the people who could best exemplify the issue, and how she's the one who presented us to Teofilo, who is her cousin, who is stateless. She also has her brothers and other people that in her family who are stateless, but Teofilo felt like a really a strong counterpoint to her story that could really intersect, and she was helping him as well with his papers. And so she was just a great partner, and we didn't know she was going to run for office. We were just looking at the different cases that she was following and hoping that eventually there'd be an arc where either someone was denied or got papers. And this was over a 5-year period, of coming back and forth to the TR, as well as eventually editing the film. And when she decided to run for office, given, there are very few in her community who do, we felt it was, we had to kind of continue that thread. And so in the edit, that became, a significant part of the story. Gladys was a different.
You're a human rights lawyer, correct? Also, yes, so that was another connection.
That's right. That was another connection. I was working in the legal. I was working in human rights law and knew about the situation also of Dominicans of Haitian descent from the time when I was working as an attorney as well. Yes, that's true. And it's interesting. It wasn't intentional, but I ended up collaborating with two lawyers who were. Gladys is a lawyer, and so is Rosa Iris. But, I can talk a little, initially, really what I wanted to do was find someone, a light-skinned Dominican of Haitian descent, well-off, upper class, who could be a counterpoint, who has no problem, because there are Dominicans of Haitian descent of that class who have no problem getting their papers. That is not an issue. They have their papers, they have their birth certificates, they have everything they need to travel. And to take advantage, given their privilege. And I wanted sort of to enter into that myself as a light-skinned person of Haitian descent, and see, if there was a way for me to sort of tell that story from that angle. It proved extremely difficult. The powerful, often sort of protect their space.
But they didn't want to come forward and also to reveal themselves as, well, I guess one of those.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And it's a very delicate thing. There was one person that I was able to follow for a number of months, but unfortunately, as a storyteller, you really want access that's sort of unbridled, that is as transparent as possible, so you have something to work with when you're in the edit. And we never got there. It was a really learning experience for me. And I'm telling a little bit about what the documentary process is like, because when you're in it, the stories are always changing and moving, right? And it's about having a vision, like this, the vision that I had about the hybrid, the Moraime story being anchored, but also the observational, talking to each other in some way was always there. But within that, as we go along, the story changes quite a bit. And so I sat down with the field producers, our Dominican field producers, who were just awesome team members, some of which were actually trained in Cuba cinema, in the Cuba, which is an outstanding cinema school. And so we had a conversation and said, well, the next thing for us to really do is to try to spend time with the ultranationalist right-wing movement in the DR, which is small, it is a minority, but it's very powerful in the media. They have money, so they can influence. And so we went actually through a very intensive casting process. And the first few people that we interviewed and spoke with were men, for the most part, and very virulent and aggressive about their position. So there were two things that went in my mind as I was, spending time with them. I was, do I want to spend the next 3 years in these intensive kind of spaces with these men who were extremely aggressive? And two, so just on a personal level, like it would just be extremely draining. And secondly, would it really do justice to the story where, portraying and working with this person or these people that we were casting, we were interviewing, would require a lot of work on our part to make them a little more complex in terms of their character. And we did not want, for example, I always sort of equate it with, the Ku Klux Klan member, the card-carrying Ku Klux Klan member who becomes part of a story where most of us can just dismiss, right? And say, I'm not like that person. That person is not in my sphere of influence. Therefore they're not really relevant or in that way. And so we really wanted to avoid dismissing this point of view. And so when we spoke with Gladys, there were a number of things for me that flashed. One, again, going back to this idea that, okay, I could spend some time with this person. I know her beliefs are really kind of extreme, and her hatred.
And she's milder than the men. Okay.
Yes, she was mild. Well, she's milder in affect. She's not yelling. She's very affable. She's nurturing. She's motherly, right? And so on the one hand, but then you hear, the hatred that she spews, which is undeniable. But what's interesting is that she could also very easily be my aunt. She could be my cousin. She could be my neighbor. You can't imagine the number of Dominicans who've watched this film and see their family members reflected in her, right? In seeing her. She can't be as easily dismissed. You're listening to it and it's kind of disorienting in some cases. And it's interesting for me that this is a kind of a women-led, film story where you see, the full continuum of points of view that these women hold. For me, these Black women hold, because for me, they're all, from a diaspora perspective and whatever. She's a Black woman.
Yeah, I know. When I went to the Dominican Republic and I, once, and I was, what's the issue here? Get to the airport. I'm confused, but neither as may. But what the timeline? I was really curious because Gladys and her colleagues, they sound so much like Trump and other ultranationalists. It even talks about how somebody from Israel came over and said, "Well, you should build a wall, like like the wall in Israel and the West Bank, the wall Trump wanted to build, and the border between Mexico and the U.S." Were you filming during his campaign or during his presidency? I mean, did she sort of align, or sort of like, oh yeah, I like this guy Trump?
Oh yeah, she's very aligned. Her husband at the time had American citizenship, and she drove him to the embassy, I think, to vote. for Trump.
Okay.
And she was, you know, she would, we started shooting before the elections with her. We met her, I met her back in 2015. So this was before, because he was, yeah. So I met her before, but was sort of filming with her when he became president. And, you know, she would flaunt connections that her colleagues have with Trump himself, and that they were actually speaking about policies, denationalization policies. I don't know if you're aware, under Trump, at the Homeland Security, there was a denationalization citizenship department that was created to look at eliminating birthright citizenship. And this is all, from what Gladys was saying, influenced by what the DR had done and their ultra right-wing sort of connections. I mean, I truly believe, and this is not sort of conspiratorial in nature, I think there are connections, you know, not that they necessarily have conferences, but between Bolsonaro, you know, the ultra right wing in the DR, the GOP, that GOP wing, and Trump, as well as Hungary and I forget the name of the woman in France. I mean,
Le Pen.
Le Pen, yes, Marine Le Pen, and you know, and certain factions of Israel as well, of the Israeli state, that are interconnected, right? But I also like to think that the opposite is also true. You know, the resistance is also interconnected. May not be as powerful money-wise, but also interconnected in terms of worldview, in terms of what world do we want to see, and you know, in methods of resistance as well. But
so,
yes.
So were you very
started shooting before? I started shooting and working with her before his election.
I'm curious also how the ultra nationalists saw you, and did you reveal that you were of Haitian descent? And if they did, they said, "Oh, well, you're different."
Yeah.
You know.
I did not reveal my Haitian identity to them. They never asked either, which is the other opposite thing that was so interesting. People were wondering, well, how did she speak to you, you know, and all of that. It was actually very easy. You know, we spoke with her. She saw me as an American and Canadian production with, you know, a North American lens. She could not, I think, fathom that Haitians came in my tone, in my skin tone. And you know, I've had this discussion many times with certain Dominicans who just cannot believe that I'm Haitian. I was born in Haiti. You know, my father's Haitian. But I didn't even get to that with her. She just assumed that, you know, I was American. I don't know if she may have thought I was white passing, or however she perceived me. She never asked. And so, and I never provided that information, because if you're not asking, then we're just going to go with the flow the way it is. And interestingly, with her, I never really had to pull teeth. I would ask one or two questions and she would just speak and not stop, not stop. And everything was, you know, whatever the conversation was, it always ended up that Haitians were to blame, you know, and it was sort of this self-fulfilling circularity of logic that's a belief system that I see that is a religion. There's no convincing her and, you know, the community that she's a part of otherwise. You know, I think it's a waste of time for us to think about convincing people whose hatred has its own logic, and they're not going to, you know, the white supremacy has sort of brainwashed their entire being, and their worldview is sealed. How do you say? It's foolproof. There are no you know, seams to open and try to change.
I was also struck by the scenes of the people in the offices, like maybe the functionaries, who some of them who were, you know, with the brown or dark skin or whatever, who could maybe be targeted themselves. How callous they were. And maybe I'm naive, but it's like, well, it's not my problem. This is your problem. This, no compassion whatsoever. And they knew they were being filmed, right?
No, they didn't.
Oh, they didn't. Okay. Okay. How did you get away with that?
Yeah, those were all undercover. Those were all undercover cameras in all of the offices. Like that opening scene with Rosa Iris, where she's having this argument with a Black woman about trying to get this young man to go back to school where he was going. That was shot undercover, and so what happened is, the way I present in some cases was helpful, but in other cases would be a detriment in terms of understanding what the community view is. And this is sort of where I would stay outside, and our field producers, who are Dominican, not of Haitian descent, Dominican, Afro-Dominicans, identify as Afro-Dominican. They wore these cameras, cameras that were hidden in their glasses. So that's how you get some of that perspective in the office. And then Rosa had her own camera on a chain.
Okay.
on a
Wow.
chain cross. Oh yeah, I went all the way. I had a water bottle that had a hidden camera, and Teofilo also had his hidden camera when we were crossing the checkpoints in the DR. And so all of those situations were undercover, because we know that the minute the camera is present, it affects how people interact, and we would lose the real nature of this bureaucratic violence that is practiced. So it was at that office. It was also at the checkpoints. We had a GoPro that was hidden in the car as well. And then it was at the office when Teofilo goes to speak to the officer at the Board of Elections to get to seek his papers. He had a vest that was that had a camera as well.
So there were some scenes that I remember at night when I guess the soldiers are checking the car. I think Teofilo was, or Juan was it? Yeah, Teofilo was.
Yeah, Juan Teofilo.
Juan Teofilo was, going back and forth, and there was it was scary. It was really, really, really scary. Were you there in the car, or is it?
Well, again, I wasn't in the car. I was in a van. So this is to tell you again the craziness about the arbitrariness. Well, the pigmentocracy, that exists. So I was in the front seat of a van with the driver, who was our production driver, and they never stopped us. We never got stopped at the checkpoints. So just to explain, these checkpoints are on the road that are specifically coming from the border of Haiti that lead into Santo Domingo, into the capital. So they have these checkpoints to check people's papers. And then arbitrarily, they'll let one person go, they'll let others go. The buses are the worst. They'll take people out, the darker skinned people out, get their papers, and they're very, Rosa explained some of this, and even Teofilo said they took him out, 15 times from the bus the last time he was on to check his papers. But in this situation, and that's why she offered, well, I'm going to come and get you in a car, because we're less likely to be bothered in a car, because the idea is that at least you might have the means, to be in a car and have a car. There are all these intersecting, decisions based on class and color that are sort of immediate unconscious by these soldiers and bureaucrats who are trying to kind of categorize you right away to see, well, how much power do I have, to pursue you. And so I was in the van, following behind, and we would never get stopped by the checkpoints. So we pass, and then we have to wait further ahead until they got through, because, I was very worried about what was going to happen, because Teofilo only had this paper from the government saying he had to be present, for his appointment. And so, I was not in there. But again, we had the field producer. One of the field producers were there, Joanne, and then it was Rosa, and her boyfriend, her partner, and who was driving, and Teofilo in the car.
Well, you very well described the everyday violence of a system like this. But when Rosa Iris decided to run for office, there was increased threats on her, and I was very afraid for her, and the film made you afraid for her, the way it was presented. So I want to ask you your response to being, filming this, and for yourself and your crew and for everybody. Were you very vigilant? Did you have security and things like that?
No, I didn't have security. I never felt myself personally in danger, but I really was concerned and very preoccupied for Rosa Iris, Teofilo, and Joanne also, and the other people on the crew. But I really, in this work, I sort of, I kind of I took their lead in terms of what was the right thing to do, how far could we go, and really listen to them in terms of those decisions. When I was here, I did reach out to some people in the community around ways of either trying to get her out if necessary, and how could we be supportive to her, given what she was facing. Because what happened with Rosa when she ran for office is that on top of her fight to defend Dominicans of Haitian descent, she was entering into this territory of deeper, political corruption, right? And sort of opening the veil on that and speaking very openly about that. And so that raised the stakes as well. Once you start talking about money and who's getting it, things get a lot dicier, And so just to say, but yeah, I never really, I never really felt threatened myself, but was in constant sort of preoccupation for the team, but especially for Rosa Iris, because our field producers, are well connected with the government, have even worked in the cinema, in the department, the cinema division in the DR. And, it's complicated also. It's not everyone is ultra nationalist. That's one thing that's very important. There's a very, strong, movement of young Afro-Dominicans, as well as certain people in different parts of the government that are, trying to change things as well, including, the people that, the party that Rosa Iris was a part of, that who are running for office. They don't win often, but they're still there kind of being, the gadflies that they need to be.
So at the end of the film, you mentioned that Rosa Iris sought asylum in the U.S. and she got it. It was very brave of her to do with all the work that she was doing, especially around for office. But I'd like to know what's happening with her now.
So Rosa Iris got asylum, which is extremely difficult, and she got it under the beginning of Trump's reign in power, which was interesting. I mean, she had a very, very strong case. And when she got here, she's living in Pittsburgh. She continues actually to do work with migrant communities in Pittsburgh and provide services. And, she does whatever work of solidarity she can with what's going on in the DR as well, with the lawyers who are working in the DR. And, she just graduated from, she got a scholarship at American University to do her LLM in human rights and humanitarian law. So she just graduated this past May with that degree. So I think eventually she's going to, pick up the mantle again to keep doing this work as an attorney. Right now, she's providing services for immigrants in Pittsburgh from Central America, and some of whom are Haitian as well, actually recently arrived to Pittsburgh. And she's arrived to Pittsburgh. She was in Pennsylvania. She arrived in Pittsburgh through this community of, she's part of a religious network who provided support for her both in the DR and here. And that's how she sort of found herself in Pittsburgh.
So for people who want to act in solidarity with, the folks who are endangered in the DR, what might you recommend? What would you point them to? And also, they give an update on where this law is vis-a-vis people who are threatened by being deported.
Sure. Repeat the first question again.
No, well, this what people can do who are
what can
want to act
yeah.
in solidarity. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things, and I'll have to kind of share the GoFund. There's two GoFundMe campaigns actually going on. One is to support the legal defense fund that is happening in the Dominican Republic. We have a grassroots partner called Incultured Company that does work to build solidarity amongst Haitians and Dominicans, both in the diaspora and on the island. And they've started a GoFundMe campaign. If you go to Incultured Company and to their website, as well as to GoFundMe, there's a fund we're looking to raise $20,000. We're about halfway there to support about 60 legal cases of Dominicans of Haitian descent who are seeking to get their citizenship back or some form of recognition. And there's also a smaller GoFundMe that Rosa Iris and I have put together to support Juan Teofilo, with medical services, and also for potential legal services for him as well to continue his legal battle. He suffered from 2 strokes about a year ago, and is back in the DR, but unable really to afford his medicine. So we've come together to raise some money for that on GoFundMe, and it'll be under Rosa Iris Diendomi, her name, the GoFundMe campaign. In terms of the law, I can dial back a little bit. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but ultimately there was so much international outcry of this sentencia, this draconian decision that denationalized people from one day to the next, and pressure on the Dominican government to do something. And so Danilo Perez, who you see there, worked with the government to provide, 2 sort of legislative options that are not full, reinstatement of citizenship, but that provide registration and paths to ultimate citizenship, where you get a sort of document that allows you to keep working and for you to ultimately be nationalized. So it's not really recognition of your birthright citizenship, but it's a path to some kind of citizenship. But what is really what Dominicans are in the human rights space are really reeling against is that this is providing a separate category of citizen, a separate category of people. It's basically a Nazi-esque measure, because they are registered in a separate book. Not knowing what could happen next, you could just list all those people and go after them. So it's not really a full recognition of birthright citizenship. However, people have to eat, right? And so if this is what is open to them, this is what they will pursue. It's also a very expensive process. You need, an attorney to help. You see through what Teofilo went through, that you're at the mercy of these bureaucrats who may or may not, do their job with you. And so from what I understand, also with COVID and the pandemic that has happened, the situation is actually worse. People are in deeper crises and are in limbo and further invisible. And there is no real sort of inexpensive sort of recourse for people. So those measures were taken to quiet the international community, but in effect are not being put into practice in a way that these folks who have been denationalized can really take advantage of. And it's very difficult. And actually right now, there's a wall actually being built. The current Luis Abinader, who is a neoliberal from a neoliberal party, just as Danilo Perez. I mean, they're different parties, but there may as well be, the same, has started building a wall keep, according to them, Haitians out and to delineate the border.
Thank you for that. There are a few questions from the audience. One was about how you think the earthquake will have an impact on the situation and regarding these issues. That's
Yeah, I'm not, I don't know what the answer is to that. I mean, the earthquake, the situation, has created a larger diaspora, of my community throughout the Americas. And that will, the way I see it is even further pressure of people to find solutions, of Haitians to find solutions. I'm not sure how directly it will affect the question of citizenship,
right.
Of Dominicans of Haitian descent. But in terms of migratory patterns, I think it's just going to be more pressure on people looking, to find a solution and leaving.
And one of the other questions is about the impact of you hope your film or think your film will have on discussions about immigration and policy in the U.S. Because the migratory issues are certainly things that are reflected in what happens about people coming to the United States.
Yes, I do hope. I mean, one of my hopes is that we see this story as not so much a window into a very specific sort of situation, but that it also be a mirror to our own communities and what's going on in our communities, because those same forces exist here, as you know. And the jury's still out with the current administration. I mean, we, under the Obama administration, the situation of our Black and brown migrants was very difficult as well. The numbers were terrible, and so we're looking at that now. And how will Haitian migrants under the I think it's the TRC, temporary.
The protective status, temporary protective status, yeah.
Temporary protective status, TPC, sorry. How will that be, treated by the current administration? So I see an interconnectedness, and then an understanding also. Can we gain a deeper understanding of how the ultra nationalists and ultra right wing folks here act and think by looking at Gladys and her community as a mirror? I try to, the work that we do, often, we try to think about it from that hemispheric lens and understanding this is all interconnected, that if we look at our racial caste system here in the United States or in Canada, or even as far down as Argentina, it's kind of all started on Hispaniola. Columbus didn't arrive in the United States, and yet, his ventures were celebrated by the United States for a very long time. It's not until recently that we've questioned that. But he did arrive on the island of Hispaniola, named it Hispaniola. The first Europeans arrived there. The first enslaved Africans arrived on that island. The first genocide against indigenous peoples happened on that island, and the first racial caste system, and a color caste system was enacted on that island. 1619, there was stuff happening before 1619 in the rest of the Americas regarding Black and brown bodies, and how they were treated, and citizenship and people's own humanities. Humanity was determined. And so, and then, that spread all across the hemisphere. So I think that, the history there is our history here. And I think it's important to understand those, that connection, especially for those of us fighting for this, for racial, social justice and all the justice, around other hierarchies as well, because there is an interconnection. The diaspora from all over the Americas has been here, and Americans have influenced also the way race plays out on the island. So,
jumping back to what you said about what the the verdict is still out of what the Biden administration and the Congress will do. I think that it's due to what we do and what activists do and what pressure people put on them immigrants' rights organizations or even organizations like the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And those things are really important. Those will determine what happens. One of the other question was you referenced the short film you made and one of the characters who was not in the film, but you made a film about. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yes, it's a short film called Elena, and I see you have the Afropop t-shirt on.
Yes.
And it was in the last season of Afropop, the Ultimate Cultural Exchange. And so it's also going to be on Vice. I'm not sure what date, and it's been doing the festival circuit lately, and it recently won Best Short Film at Black Star. And so the story Elena, I don't want to give it all up because I want people to watch it. Elena's story is actually sort of, again, a story of a strong Black woman fighting for the rights of her family specifically, as well as her community. She's also a member of the same organization that Rosa is a part of. And I spent, a number of years with her as well. But her arc has a sort of it ends on a positive note. She does, well, I don't want to give it up. But she basically takes on, the government apparatus to get papers for herself, for her mother, who is a Haitian migrant, and for her father, who is a Haitian migrant, who is a sugarcane cutter, who is one of the, the many Haitian migrants who came by being solicited by the Dominican government in collaboration with the Haitian government and brought to the DR to work on the sugarcane fields, but who were then left without papers. And so we see her working towards, her being able to continue her studies by getting, the legitimate documents that she needs. And it's about a 30-minute piece.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Put a link to for people in the chat for more information about the film. And we know the film has been broadcast on PBS, and it will be available for streaming until the 19th?
Yes, until August 19th.
August 19th.
Yes.
We're hitting up against the clock, but I have a question about, and I think other people will want to know, has the film been shown in the Dominican Republic or where else in the Americas? Maybe it's been screened.
Yeah, the film has not yet screened in the Dominican Republic. I did share it with Gladys, who sent me a very nasty message on WhatsApp. But that
Why?
Was
why? Well, she thought you were unfair to her?
Not unfair to her. She said everything else were lies. Everything else that I was saying, everything else in the story was lies, that I was propagating lies about the Haitian reality in the DR. So that was an interesting reaction, but it was to be expected. And we have some scheduled screenings of the film in Mexico, which I'm very excited about, with Afro-Mexican community, and in the Tulum Film Festival. And we are also screening. We were part of a screening series in Colombia. There's an Afro-Colombian film festival that does a number of different cities, but these were all done, virtually because of the pandemic. And we had a very transformative conversation with Black women from Cali and from the Pacific coast of Colombia with Rosa Iris. That was really an act of solidarity that I couldn't ask for more in terms of what the film could provide. I mean, this is what it was about, really creating acts of solidarity where, we no longer feel isolated in the experiences that we're living through, and being able to find sort of strength and nourishment by not only seeing oneself represented, but being inspired by people like Rosa Iris and other Black women. So that was a very transformative. It's a film festival series. I can't remember the exact acronym, but they do every year. And it's out of Cali, which is a very significant Black city in South America. It's I had not known that it was the second largest Black city after Salvador, the Bahia.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whoa,
Well,
that's very Black.
Yeah, that is. Yeah. I learned that last year because I'd done a workshop with Colombian filmmakers down there, and I was on the Pacific Coast, and so yeah, exciting place to be. Hopefully, once the pandemic and other things, happen, are behind us, we'll be able to interact in person more. Yeah.
Is there something else you want to say before we?
No, I mean, it's been a pleasure. I really thank you very much, MoAD and Cornelius, and it's been a real pleasure to be in conversation. Yeah. And yes, I mean, what you said, just to underline that it's really up to us in terms of what the administration does. And, connecting with those organizations here, it's really important.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much for this conversation and for your film. And on to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Good to see you. Take care.
Thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation and for your incredible work, Michèle. I'm so happy to provide a platform for people to see it and to hear you speak about it. I do want to let people know that we'll be having the next African Diaspora Film Club on Sunday, September 12th. It will be at a special time to accommodate the filmmakers' time zone. We'll be discussing Chez Jolie Coiffure, and the filmmaker Rosine Backham is in, so we'll be Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, and you can register for that program on our website. We also have a survey that we would love for you to fill out to give us feedback about today's program. I put the link in the chat, and it should also pop up for you when you close your Zoom window. If you can support MoAD in any way, we of course always accept any donations to support the work that we do. And finally, we would love to thank Black Public Media for their support of Black film and this program series. And you can see what they're doing on Afropop, the Ultimate Cultural Exchange, and I have the link in the chat as well. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we look forward to your next work, Michèle.
Yes.
Thank
you, Michèle.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.